to the crowd. Okie doke. And now I can't figure out how to share my screen because that's disappeared off the bottom. That's really weird. Here we go. Sorry. You always seem competent until you try to do that with other people. All right, so I'm just going to use the slideshow and go back one. No? Okay, so just to introduce what we're doing, the focus of today is media coverage of elite female athletes with disabilities, and we have three presenters, all of us coming at the topic from slightly different perspectives. So Dr. Becky Clark will go first, and she'll reintroduce herself in terms of her background, and then Dr. Dunja Antonovic will speak second, talking about the Paralympics more broadly, and then I'll present at the end a case study of a longitudinal study I've been doing of New Zealand media coverage of the Paralympics, which is really starting to show some quite significant movement over time in terms of how the Paralympic Games are being represented. So we have a couple of housekeeping points. Please mute yourself during the session by clicking the mute button. And if you want to see closed captions, please click the CC to turn on, which is down on the bottom. You'll see live transcript to turn on live captions. And if you want to ask any questions or make any comments or show your reactions, you can use the reaction function, which has hands up and clapping and hearts and laughing, all sorts of different emojis, and then also in the chat function. So I'm going to hand over to Becky now to introduce herself and let us know what's happening.
Okay, let's see. Yeah, make sure I wasn't muted. Hello and welcome, world. We're happy that you're here today. And I just want to say that I'm deaf, and I may be a line or two behind you two because I'm reading the captions as I go along. It's not that I'm not answering you. Just give me a chance to catch up, okay? And any questions? Also, I'm a three-time deaf Olympian. 1 gold, 2 silver, USA, yeah. But anyway, today what I'm going to do is just start off. A lot of you may already, are familiar with the intro information. I'm going to be covering basically to start off with like the spectrum of disabilities and some of the disability models. And I'm going to do that very brief because there are many disability models. So let's start with what we have on the screen. I see Tony added that picture, but oh God, I was so young. Back in 85 in Los Angeles, it's the 1985 Deaf Olympics. And so Germany came, well, at that time it was known as West Germany, came in second and Japan third. But Germany got us back 4 years down the road. And Japan finished third again, but they are phenomenal. The entire Deaf Olympics, Paralympics was really, really fantastic teams with Japanese and Canadians as well. And of course, some of the Europeans. Australia is very strong too. I don't know about New Zealand, Tony. Get in there. Okay. All right. We start with basically the spectrum of disabilities for those like my deafness or any deafness is a hearing impairment. It's a hidden disability. You can't really see it unless you have someone that identifies with deaf culture and you see them signing, that they may give you an idea. But basically, hearing loss is invisible, and there are a lot of other invisible disabilities as well. So they go from being from one spectrum of being hidden, you cannot see, to fully visible mobility, or those in a wheelchair that you can actually see, or visually impaired or blind person with their walking cane or their senile dog. Disabilities also can be single to multiple, and I'll get to that when I get to the games itself. And lastly, congenital or to acquired. And the high percentage of people with disabilities, including the sports women, tend to be acquired. A smaller percentage tends to be those who were born with a disability. Okay, next screen, Tony. So this is some of you may be familiar with some of these models. One of the newer models is the affirmation model. Let me start with the good old medical model that got started in the early 20th century. Basically, the medical model focuses on the biological and medical component of the disability. Its perspective is you see someone, quote, broken or with a disability, you want to cure it or fix it. And that's not a very popular model. It is for medical doctors when you go to see what's wrong with you, if there's something wrong with you. And then, moving on to the social model. The social model basically got its start in modern times, later on in the late 20th century, where with disability, well, I guess in the 60s, 70s, with the disability civil rights movement. And basically it just says the focus is not the individual's fault as it is the medical issue, that the person has a disability. It focuses on what society does not provide. It's more of an oppression. There are barriers that need to be replaced for accessibility. So that's what the social model is. And the social relational model, it kind of embraces both of the medical and social model, but it's like we have someone with a disability, or your perspective of disability is that you accept the disability as it is, as not a negative thing or a part of someone's negative part of someone's identity, but it also, in general, it recognizes the barriers and the oppression and discrimination of people with disabilities. Now, the tragedy model, I guess we all know what that is. It's more of a pity model. Oh, those poor disabled people. I'm sure that, a few of us who are on the panel have some stories, who those of us who have a disability that we probably hear to this day. But it's more like we're helpless. We need to be taken care of. We're not able to function in life itself, what quote unquote normal. We're not able to work and all sorts of things that we're not quote normal. Okay. Now the most recent newer model that's come out with I think it was John Swain and Sally French. The affirmation model, it's come through the disability art movement. There's art movement, but it embraces the disability culture and community, and the person with the disability to not focus on the disability itself, but it's part of the person's identity in a positive way. It would make a lifestyle and some of the adjustments and whatsoever, but it's a positive cultural and social identity that encompasses the disability. So we can come back to that later too if you have any questions. But I think for some of you, or for a lot of you who have worked in the disability world or have some contact or somewhat in your family, you pretty much maybe recognize a few of these models. Okay, next. Now we're gonna get into sport, my favorite. Okay, we have what we're gonna do today. We're gonna be covering the sport media coverage with elite sports women with disabilities, and the three major disability deaf sport competitions in the world is Paralympics, which got it started in, I believe it was 1948, and at about 60 miles outside of London. And the first international games for the Paralympics was 1952. And the Deaf Olympics is the second oldest. I'm going to get into specific of each games and then move on to the sports media. All right, the Deaf Olympics has been around since 1924. It was also established in Europe and France. And we had one woman that was part of the first games. All right, in the Special Olympics, wait, go back. The Special Olympics.
Oh, sorry.
The Special Olympics, got us started in 1968 with the former president, John Kennedy, sister, Eunice, older sister, who founded the Special Olympics. They had a sister, an older sister with an intellectual disability. And so the whole family, the Kennedy family, really embraced the Special Olympics, set it up, and Eunice Kennedy Schreiber, if I pronounce her last name right, Schreiber, it's grown tremendously. There's over 7,000 athletes and over 200, I think it was 185 countries recently in the 2019 World Games in Saudi Arabia. And the females have been a part of the Special Olympic movement for years. Okay, then we say the Paralympics and the Deaf Olympics. I'll get into how they're different. Let's go to the next slide, Tony. Okay, thank you. All right, for the Paralympic Games, the multi-disability, multi-sport international competition for elite athletes with disabilities. There's 10 classification categories, including physical, visual impairment, intellectual, and others. It's governed by the International Paralympic Committee, and its headquarters is in Bonn, Germany. And it's ongoing collaboration and sanction with the International Olympic Committee. It has both. The model is based on the Olympic Games. They have summer, winter games to alternate every 2 years, but the summer games, they're 4 years apart. Every 4 years, alternated every 2 years. Held the same year and location following the Olympic Games. If you notice, it's usually 2 to 3 weeks different. And I believe Korea was the first, South Korea was the first, correct me if I'm wrong, was the first time that they did the parallel games there, the Paralympics following the Olympics. I believe that was back in 86, well, I remember what, 88 games, if I'm correct. Okay, next. Tony, okay. All right, as I said before about the Deaf Olympics now, let me just say a little bit about it, and then I'll do some differences between the Deaf Olympics and the Paralympics, because I get a lot of questions. Why aren't deaf athletes in the Paralympics? And it's a complicated response to that. Okay. It is also governed by the International Committee of Sports for the Deaf, and the headquarters are in Switzerland, and it's recognized by the International Olympic Committee as well. The only classification for the Deaf Olympics is to have a minimum 55 decibel per tone average hearing loss in your better ear. So it means really deaf for that. Hearing aids and cochlear implants are not permitted in the competition to give a level playing field. And it's also based on, the games are also based on the Olympic motto, summer, winter, Deaf Olympics held every 4 years, alternating 2-year cycles for elite deaf and hard of hearing athletes. And the last comment I had on there about deaf and hard of hearing athletes did not consider themselves, quote, disabled in the way that it is defined. If you say disability, I myself, I will say, yes, I have a disability, I'm deaf, okay? But in terms of sport itself, I'm not disabled. I'm an able-bodied person, deaf and hard of hearing or able-bodied. So there's no special classifications, and nor are the rules altered in any way other than, that's not the rules, but visual cues are substituted for sounds. For example, a flashing light for starting signals, or a flag, a touch. Okay, next is the Special Olympics. I pretty much said that. The basic tenet for the mission of the Special Olympics is provide year-round sports training and athletic competition, a variety of Olympic type sports for children and adults with intellectual, I can't talk. I need more coffee. It's too early for me in New York. With intellectual disabilities by giving them continuing opportunities to develop their fitness, demonstrate courage, experience joy, and participate in sharing of gifts, skills, and friendships with their families and other Special Olympics athletes in the community. It's also recognized by the International Olympic Committee. If you notice that the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, is very strict on who can use the word Olympic. Well, the Special Olympics have been around a long time and very powerful family with a lot of money behind it and a lot of power. So they were allowed to keep the Olympics in their name. The Deaf Olympics, we started out at the Silent Games, the International Silent Games. And then it became, I don't know why, because Tony can testify, most of us deaf people can be very loud. So we realize that we can't manage our, our voice volume. So if it's okay if you tell me if I'm talking too loud or if I'm not talking loud enough, okay? All right, and then it also has Summer and Winter Olympics that are based every 4 years, alternating 2-year cycles. But they have what's known as Special Olympics World Games, and that's usually every 2 years in and of itself. And the media for the Special Olympics has just like exploded in the last 2 or 3 years. But I'll come to that in a few minutes too. I want to briefly say between the all right, someone talking? Oh, I heard something. Oh, okay. Okay. The Paralympics and the Deaf Olympics. The classification, there is no deaf classification in the Paralympics. And actually, the Deaf Olympics were one of the founder members of the Paralympic Committee, the IPC, the International Paralympic Committee. So they don't have an agreement, but the issue is they're like, with the Deaf Olympics, there are at least 4,000 athletes, 3,000 to 4,000 every 4 years with the winter. Of course, the winter games are smaller than the summer games. That's the same for all the other, for the Olympics and Special Olympics as well. But they do want to limit the opportunities for a large number. And the IPC, the large number of athletes, I think the IPC, the average, Tony, someone, Andrea, or someone can tell me, I think it was the average also between 3,000 and 4,000 athletes. I think, yeah, per Olympic game, per summer games. And so they also have specific classifications, and in those classifications, there are only so many slots for athletes. So if we were to bring in the Deaf Olympics or deaf athletes, and then would be a limited number. So that didn't sit well with the Deaf Olympic Committee, but I don't want to get into politics now, but right now, because of the modernization of the Paralympics, and the more and more people are being knowledgeable about athletes with disabilities because of the media that we're seeing, is that I'm trying to work on bringing the ICSD, which is the International Committee of Sports for the Deaf, which is the governing body, and the Paralympics governing body together to discuss that we have a classification of deaf athletes. But if they wanted to, because the deaf games themselves, it is run by deaf people. It's coached by deaf coaches, though there are some coaches who have regular hearing. And so it's different than the other games. The other games, it doesn't matter what if you have a disability or not, but the deaf games, it needs to come a long way in changing their own thought process, being closed off. So I'm hoping to see that happen within the next 10 to 15 years, where there would be the classification for deaf athletes in the Paralympics. I think we all should be together, but that's a story for another time. Okay, let's move on. All right, going to next. Okay, I have a whole list of, the games, the comparison between all of these games here, including the Olympics for dating back to 2000 for female participation. But I just decided, because I know Tony and Dunja will be talking a lot, the comparison between the Olympics and Paralympics. So I didn't want to be redundant. So with the Deaf Olympics, we just say in 2017 here is we were to have in 2021, but because of the COVID and pandemic, it was postponed to November in Rio, Brazil, in 2022. I think that in November, yeah. So I would have that. But here are the stats from what I'm saying on female competitors at the last games. The Tokyo Olympic Games, 49% participation competitors. And the Paralympics had 42%. Deaf Olympics in the last one, Summer Games in 2017, had 50%, which is mind-boggling. Normally it's around 30%, but each year it's been increasing. And the 2019 Special Olympics World Games recently in Saudi Arabia was 38%. So they say about 40% of their female athletes are in the Special Olympic Games. But they made another statistic that was really fascinating to me, is that over 50% of the Special Olympics staff are female. Yeah, good to go. So I will come back to, we go back and forth with, the panel and of course, the participants as well. I'm really glad to hear that we do have some wheelchair basketball players in here too. So do you want to go? Who's next? Dunja?
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Introduce yourself. Yes.
Yes, sure. Thank you. My name is Dunya Antunovic. As I mentioned earlier, some of you might have been there for the introductions, but just in case, I'll repeat. I'm currently at the University of Minnesota. I am a sports media scholar who focuses on representations of gender and primarily on the context of women's sport. In relation to this particular presentation, I just want to mention that I don't have lived experience with disability, but as an educator of sports media, I find it really important to prepare journalists to cover issues of disability and to, in this context, particularly cover the Paralympic Games. In my previous role, I was teaching in a sports communication program, so teaching classes that specifically prepared students for the media industry. Right now, I am an affiliate scholar with the Tucker Center for Research on Girls and Women in Sport at the University of Minnesota. And so we focus specifically on media representations of women's sport as one of our research areas. My sort of point of entry here is thinking about the broader relationship between the media and specifically the Paralympics in relation to sort of the context of the relationship between media and larger, what we call mega events, right? Obviously, media have had a tremendous impact on the way sports are organized, the way viewers perceive sports. Just in general, I'll share some patterns based on research, but in general, sports media have a very narrow, what we call agenda, right? There is a lot of emphasis on particularly a select few men's sports, and which sports those are depends really on the context. Obviously in the US, it might be men's American football. In Europe, it might be men's soccer. But in this context, women's sports are very much underrepresented and marginalized. And Dr. Bruce has done a lot of research on this that synthesizes those patterns. And specifically, athletes with disability and women with disability are virtually absent from a lot of media coverage when we look at sort of longitudinal patterns, except during international events, such as, in this case, a little bit more so over the last few years during the Paralympics. I'm referencing here some historical context in terms of the effects on mediatization on the Paralympics. The emergence of the Paralympics around the sort of 1950s, 1960s and onward really coincided with the rise of television as a mass medium, the beginning of live sporting events coverage, this sort of as sort of mega events became more of a spectacle, so the sort of participation in elite events grow, and especially, you know, even the Olympics started adding more and more women's sports, right? And so a lot of these forces were sort of happening together. In 1992 at the Barcelona Paralympics, there was live coverage in Europe. 96 Atlanta Olympics was significant for several reasons, including because there was television contracts and sponsorship and increased sponsorship. If some of you might also know that the Atlanta Games have been heralded as this year of the women, right? And sort of the Women's Olympics in 1996 because of women's participation and success. And one of the things that we are still noticing in sort of some of these narratives around Year of the Women or women's Year of Women's Sport is that often athletes with disability get sort of excluded from those conversations. 2000 Sydney Paralympics, there's some data to suggest that there was an emergence of celebrity athletes, so focus on individual athletes who have, you know, with significant accomplishments. And then the other relevant and really important sort of component has been the rise of digital media, and we're not seeing as much of a shift as perhaps some scholars have hoped or thought would be in terms of how traditional media outlets are representing sports or the types of sports that they're representing. What we're seeing is that they're really emphasizing more and more of the same. But what we are seeing with digital media channels is that there are more voices and stakeholders producing content. And so the International Paralympic Committee has their own media channel, has an extensive platform in terms of sort of telling stories. And then, of course, recently athletes have also been using their digital platforms to bring visibility. We can go to the next slide. That talks about sort of the general patterns that we know in a routine media coverage. Athletes with disability are very much underrepresented. There is data from Europe on social media and public service media organizations, social media accounts that suggest that disability sport is 0.58% of the total coverage. And often when we see some of the data, there isn't sort of they weren't, scholars sometimes don't really indicate, you know, what portion of that coverage is specifically dedicated to women. However, we do know some patterns. Generally, there's significantly less coverage of the Paralympic Games than of the Olympic Games. What happens is essentially news organizations send journalists to the Olympics, and then the journalists come back, and then they don't sort of go back 2 weeks later for the Paralympic Games. And I'll talk a little bit about what, you know, the implications of that and how that's explained and why that explanation doesn't work. And then in terms of representation patterns and sort of constructions of what we call sort of constructions, right, of gender and disabilities that, you know, Becky talked about this medical model. And so we very much see evidence of this medicalized descriptions of athletes and the focus on impairment. One of the sort of continuous patterns is what scholars refer to as supercrip stereotype, which sort of simultaneously places too high of an expectation on athletes with disability, and at the same time it's also presenting these expectations as very low. It's a very kind of complicated stereotype that ultimately, from the perspective of athletes who have been interviewed and can sort of create really negative perceptions. And then the other pattern that we see, and I know I know Tony will talk about this, is that athletes from home country are more likely to be represented than athletes from other countries. So when we look at sort of national, media outlets within a particular national context, they tend to sort of talk about their own athletes, and that the visibility of disability is very different also. I also have some very minimal data in terms of this, but these are also, I mean, this particular pattern is very consistent also with Olympic coverage in terms of emphasis on home athletes. But as Tony will show, there are some patterns that are specific to the Paralympic Games. We can go to the next slide. To talk about sort of the specific coverage of women's sports and the problematic gendered patterns. Women are underrepresented, but receive attention when representing the nation. Again, this is sort of a broader pattern, but also applies to coverage of the Paralympics. There is varying data in terms of the range of percentages. We like to look at content and measure and count and calculate this coverage. And women's sports, I mean, in some cases there's in some contexts it's even like around 10% of the coverage. But in terms of the Paralympics, these numbers are a little bit higher. They're not equal. Men's sports tend to receive around 60% of coverage, or even more in some cases, more than 70%, and women's sports tend to receive around 20 to 40% of the coverage. As Becky mentioned, the percentage of women participating at the Paralympics is still lower than the percentage of men, and so one of the sort of contextual factors here is whether media coverage sort of mirrors those representation patterns. Some scholars are also sort of making calculations depending on medal counts, right? Because we know that women tend to get coverage when they win medals. But ultimately, the reality is that the coverage is still unequal, right? And so we can contextualize all we want, but these are the numbers that we observe. There's also some problematic patterns in terms of constructions of gender, and I will just mention some general patterns, and I know Tony will have data on this, but women are often portrayed in passive poses, and sort of outside of the athletic context, right? So not in competition, although the images that Tony selected for this slide very much show athletes competing. There is also sort of this infantilizing depiction of women with disabilities in particular that is often present in media coverage, and then some complicated constructions of femininity in terms of, we know that there have been sort of patterns of sexually objectifying female athletes, but there have also been some patterns of constructing femininity in terms of these stereotypical gender norms, and so those constructions of femininity get quite complex, especially in the current media environment where athletes are also using their own platforms. And so again, Tony has done a lot of work on this as well. So we can go to the next slide. And so just to sort of summarize some of the main patterns, and maybe also talking here a little bit about the industry perspective and some of the things that I have observed as an educator. And some of these patterns are, of course, based on previous research that scholars have observed. And I've also been working with Dr. Andrea Bondon at the University of British Columbia, and we have a forthcoming article that's going to be published in maybe a couple of months in the International Journal of Sports Communication, where we talk about how some of these patterns can be challenged. But generally, one of the things that we're seeing in terms of these narratives around women's sport, and specifically around gender equity, these tend to often exclude athletes with disabilities. We also obviously see a continued underrepresentation of women at the Paralympic Games, although the numbers have been increasing. From a journalistic perspective, there's a lack of training for journalists, and I've had the chance to sort of observe this in the sports communication classroom and sport management fields as well, that, you know, even when we look at textbooks, you know, often we have to bring supplementary material to prepare students to cover the Paralympics specifically, because some of that is not covered. And so when sports journal, and generally, you know, we see this generally in women's sports, right, that often journalists don't have routine experience of covering women's sports. So once they get to these mega events where women are succeeding, then, you know, there becomes sort of this lack of knowledge, and particularly when it comes to the Paralympics, you know, whether the journalists understand the context, do they understand the classification system, do they understand sort of the broader, the ways in which they are replicating maybe stereotypes, right? I mean, some of that needs to be, we would argue, embedded into journalism education. There's also one of the things that we the journalists would say is that there are financial concerns, because it's expensive to fly journalists to the Paralympics, especially once they attended the Olympic Games. And so I really don't want to get into the whole like question of structure, because that's way beyond this. But I think on a practical level, I would argue that there are ways for media organizations to really invest in covering Paralympic athletes, even sort of on that local level, right? And so certainly there are ways to sort of tell these stories, even within the constraints, the budgetary constraints. And then another significant issue is the underrepresentation of journalists with disability in the industry. Generally, the media industries lacks diversity, and especially in the US context, there is a lot of data on this. But the question is, are these spaces accessible to journalists with disability? You know, are there opportunities for athletes with disability to be covered by journalists who sort of can at least to a certain extent relate to those experiences? And so that's also another problem. We can go to the next slide. And so I will just sort of mention a few potential strategies, and again, so a lot of these are supported by empirical evidence. And then we can have a discussion, and I would be really interested in hearing from those of you who are attending the panel as well, whether you think these strategies would work or not, or what can be done better. Is that we would argue or I would argue, and Angie and I argue, that ethical journalistic practices in relation to coverage of athletes with disability are, really important. It's journalists' ethical responsibility to know how to cover athletes with disabilities. And that can lead to a better relationship between sport journalists and athletes, based on some of the conversations that I've had with a few Paralympians. Is one thing that they say is that journalists often ask questions that are just like, they're insensitive, or just not, addressing certain components of their experience that are just not relevant for athletic competition, right? And so obviously, if journalists are better prepared, then that will result in a better conversation with athletes. There is also some evidence, particularly in research on media psychology, that good journalism and sort of less stereotypical coverage actually changes people's perception, not just about athletes with disability, but also about the media organization, right? And so when these stories are depict athletes in a way that is, within the athletic context, that doesn't draw on those problematic tropes, then, the audience also perceives the quality of the media organization as higher. And then, of course, ultimately, the question is, how can this coverage also just generally change perceptions about disability? And I think considering the media prominence of especially the Paralympics, this is an important factor for journalists to consider. And I will turn it over to Tony.
Thank you, Dunja. Buenos dias, konnichiwa. Hello, everyone. My name's Tony Bruce. I work at the University of Auckland in New Zealand. And my background is actually in journalism originally. So I started out my early career as a news reporter and then have since done some full-time work as a sports reporter. And I continue at the moment to do writing as a columnist for one of New Zealand's new organizations called Newsroom. And they started a solely female sports section, which is called Locker Room. So just on the right-hand side, you can see this is a column that I wrote before the Paralympics, just based on the existing research, kind of getting people to think about 10 different things they might consider while they're actually watching the Paralympics. And I've written a follow-up of the patterns that I saw in this Paralympics, some of which I'll share with you today that I hope will be coming out next week. And for those of you who are researchers or interested in reading accessible academic work about the Paralympics, on the left-hand side is a completely free online resource, olympicanalysis.org, which brought together hundreds actually of academics from around the world to write short 800-word pieces about the Olympic Games and the Paralympic Games. So I've written one about each of those, but I think those of you that are interested in issues of representation, this is an incredibly accessible and free resource, as long as you have internet access, of course. And like Dunya, I'm able-bodied. But I teach a lot about disability in class because I teach sociological issues in sport. And the closest I've come to understanding disability from an empirical perspective was when I took a somersault down a set of stairs a couple of years ago and broke my back. And I found it interesting that I was lying in hospital with an unstable fracture for 3 days before surgery, contemplating what my life might be like and thinking, am I too old to participate in the Paralympic Games? So I was trying to have a really positive attitude about what my future might be. Anyway, what I want to do is just take you through the results of a study I've been doing since 2008. And I also have some 2004 data from one of my master's students, looking at media coverage of the Paralympic Games in New Zealand, particularly focusing on images, but also looking at coverage overall. And so generally what I want to make the case is that things are generally moving in what I would consider a positive direction in terms of treating the Paralympics seriously, and in New Zealand's case, particularly in terms of equity, in terms of gender diversity. But definitely the New Zealand results reflect global patterns. There's no doubt about that. So I've prepared a whole lot of fancy little slides that I had a lot of fun doing. So generally speaking, Paralympics will be in blue and Olympics will be in yellow. And one thing I found really interesting is that when I started tracking officially reported results of people who watched the live broadcasts, you can see that up to 2008, the Olympics was definitely in the lead, but there's been quite a drop off in terms of people watching the Olympics live since 2012 in London. And you'll see the little arrow off to the right for Tokyo 2020. Those results aren't out yet, but all the evidence seems to suggest that the global audience will have dropped further. Whereas the Paralympics have been since 2004 on quite a rapid increase. These numbers are in billions. So the most recent ones we have data for was at Rio 2016, 4.1 billion people tuned into the Paralympics for at least a minute. And so it may well be that in terms of the live broadcasts that the Paralympics are now doing better than the Olympics. But Dunja talked a little bit about social media, and there's definitely a big gap in social media between the Olympics and the Paralympics. So for example, in 2016, there were 7.2 billion social media video views of official Olympic content and 1 billion Paralympic engagements on digital channels. So it seems like perhaps the Olympics audience might be moving more to digital, and the Paralympics audience may still be much more strongly in terms of live coverage. One of the positive things I thought this year was that New Zealand sent one reporter, and as far as I can tell, one camera person to cover the Paralympics, which was markedly lower than the Olympics. So a lot of our coverage came directly from the official broadcaster. But the public in New Zealand got really, really annoyed when they didn't actually get live coverage of New Zealand athletes, particularly ones that won medals. So we missed various medal ceremonies, and in some cases we actually missed the winning jump or the winning throw or the winning toss. And there was quite strong public backlash against that. I've got a couple of those at the bottom. But also the media published quite a few stories about the way in which the New Zealand public was disappointed that the public broadcaster had promised to cover every New Zealand event live and wasn't actually able to deliver on that. So I actually think that's quite a good sign, because people feel strongly enough that they're going to write on the New Zealand Olympic team official Facebook account, or they're going to write a column about it, or they're going to contact Television New Zealand and actually complain. So in some ways, that tells us that there is an audience out there that is paying attention and actually is looking for good quality coverage. One of the other findings is that Paralympic coverage, the amount of the difference between the amount of coverage of the Paralympics and the Olympics is actually decreasing. So if you look at 2008 in Beijing, the Paralympics got 37 times less coverage than the Olympics. But if we look at Tokyo 2020, that difference had dropped to 6.7 times less coverage. And so even though the difference in the number of medals and the difference in the number of athletes stays relatively stable, we actually start to see that the Paralympic coverage is starting to get closer and closer in terms of amount, which I think is a really positive sign. I should point out at this point that I've been studying media coverage of sport, particularly gender, for nearly 30 years. And I got so depressed about the way things weren't changing that I've decided, wherever possible, I'm going to focus on the positives, because that's the only way that I can actually continue to do this research. So I may be being slightly over optimistic, shall we say. So the next thing I think that's really interesting is the increasing nationalistic focus. So this is particularly in the New Zealand media, obviously. And although there hasn't really been a major focus of a lot of the studies, there is pretty strong evidence across a lot of different countries, as Dunya pointed out earlier, that countries tend to focus on their own athletes much more than they do athletes from other countries. But you'll see in 2016, it really started to diverge, that the amount of coverage of athletes from other countries stayed about the same. This is actually the number of stories, but the number of stories about New Zealand really increased. And the reason that I'm thinking explains this is that by 2016, all the news coverage was online. And so when newspapers or news outlets go online, they're no longer limited by the physical constraint of the number of newspaper pages that can be published. So my 2008 study was fully print newspapers, and you can see that there weren't very many stories at all, and there wasn't much difference between the national and international. But as we've got this now, theoretically unlimited amount of space to write about Paralympics and Olympics, we can start to see that there's more interest being paid to the Paralympics. Well, it's still not necessarily even. There's certainly something going on there. But New Zealand definitely focuses on home nation athletes. 86% of all images in Tokyo 2020 were of New Zealanders. And this points to the power of this discourse of nationalism, in which I argue that Paralympic athletes shift from being constructed as disabled athletes to being our nation's athletes. And usually this shift involves quite significant coverage on medalists because their success reflects well upon the nation. One other thing that really does buck the international trend is that for the last 2 Paralympics, coverage of sportswomen has absolutely dominated coverage of sportsmen. So men are in blue, women are in a lovely orange, but you can see that in 2004, hardly any sportswomen got any coverage. And part of that was because, I suggest, they didn't win any medals at all. And the men won 10 out of 10 of the medals that New Zealand won. What's interesting is that in 2008, the women won 9 of the 12 medals, and that definitely increased their amount of coverage. But the men, that sort of history of male dominance was still there, with the men getting, double the amount the women did. But our women since 2008 have actually been incredibly successful. They won 14 out of 17 medals in 2012 and 10 of 12 medals in Tokyo 2020. And so that consistent success by our sportswomen means that they're known to the public, they're expected to win, the media are comfortable and familiar with them. And so that has actually led to, an almost complete reversal in terms of which gender is actually getting the most coverage. It's probably, helped, unfortunately, by the lack of success of our male teams. So in some ways, there's a very strong intersection here between gender and success. Now, this pattern you don't see so much in countries with lots of athletes participating, because in those countries, the media often have to choose between which athletes they're going to focus on. Because in New Zealand, we have so few medalists, all of them are important. And so therefore, I think that creates a condition under which sportswomen are more likely to get attention. One of the other things that's really interesting is that even though a lot of the patterns are quite similar for sportsmen and sportswomen, the gender dimensions are more intense for sportswomen. So, for example, if you look at the second point, 95% of females' photographs focused on New Zealand women versus only 72% of the overall photographs focusing on New Zealand men. So when you see patterns like that, that starts to tell you that one message for women's sport is that the media's primary interest is our women, our home nation women, but that perhaps we have some interest in men from other countries, not just our own men. And it's also reflected in the medal winners. So while you can see that the medalist focus, overall 79% of the focus of sportswomen was on medalists, but only 28% of the men. So that tells us again that we are very interested in our women if they win for the nation, but men of all nations, and whether they win or not, they actually are deserving of media coverage. And just going back to that sort of that gender imbalance, 66% of the media coverage was sportswomen and 33% was men. And the last one I thought I would show you is again that real focus on women who are medalists. So even though sportswomen got much more coverage than men in New Zealand in 2020, Tokyo 2020, 81% of the images of New Zealand sportswomen focused on medalists. Granted, we had quite a few of them, whereas only 26% of the photographs of men focused on medalists. So we again see this kind of intensity for sportswomen that if you want to get media coverage, you need to actually win a medal. So my argument about that is that when sportswomen compete and win, they're seen as successful national citizens rather than as female athletes. Okay. And then I just wanted to Dunya introduce that point about whether your disability is visible or not visible. In the first 2 cycles of the study, it was really huge differences in terms of whether visibility whether disability was visible or not. So you can see on the bottom line that only 1/3 of the images of New Zealand athletes showed their disabilities in the first 2 iterations, but 88% and 73% of the images of athletes from other countries showed their disability. And those numbers dropped for both groups in 2016 and have stayed lower, at least for the New Zealand athletes. And so in some ways, I think this is another function that's related to how online news is presented. So online news, often you can see on the image on the left, uses a cropped down image of a bigger picture. So when my analysis at this point is only on those thumbnail images that are used to promote their Paralympic stories. So you can see that with Jessica Hamill in the thumbnail that they used to promote, no disability visible, but when you open up the article, you can actually see that she is holding a stability pole, and so therefore her disability is visible. So I think that pattern might change a little bit. So I think there are some changes over time that are actually a real reflection of the change in the way that media is being presented to us. There is one thing that I and other researchers have been quite concerned about over time is what I call the exoticization of disability. And this was particularly visible in 2008, where, as you can see from the 3 photos that look like they were taken out of a newspaper, it was only overseas athletes who were exoticized. And by that, I mean that they focus on athletes often with multiple limb disabilities, not using any technology, no story to go with the image, and nothing really about the athlete except their name, their event, maybe what country they come from, but there's no follow-up, there's no coverage of their results, no background information about who they are and why they might actually be photographed. So exoticization puts these disabled bodies out there for an able-bodied audience to consume, and it constructs Paralympic athletes as not like us, as opposed to be seen as like us. The photograph on the right's from 2012, and it's slightly better because at least we have some information about the swimmer. It's only a paragraph, but it tells us, that he's won 16 Paralympic medals. He'll participate in his 6 Paralympic Games, and he has 4 world swimming records. So we get at least a little bit of brief background, but again, no story, no follow-up on, no further coverage of this athlete during the Paralympic Games. But again, the shift to fully online, we've actually, or I've noticed a reduced exoticization. So in 2016, there was a focus on Ibrahim Hamadtou, who is from Egypt, who's a table tennis player who plays with the bat in his mouth and uses his foot to toss the ball. So on the left, there was an exoticized headline and a thumbnail, but there was a story, some results, and even live action video in background to his story. In 2021, they told his story again, no video this time, but certainly most of the articles had at least two photographs of him in action, and we learned about who he was and what had motivated him to participate in the Paralympics. And the same with the Brazilian swimmer. The photo itself exoticizes him because he's shown at the starting blocks of a backstroke, stabilizing himself with a towel in his mouth that's being held by one of the officials to give him that stability before the start of the race. But again, we had a short story about him, so we got to know him as more than a body to be looked at. So I think that that can be seen as an improvement as well. Okay, just got a few more to go. So one of the other things that we've been following on from that is like how many images actually have a story that goes with them. And you can see that pattern changing again as we move into the online environment. So 2018, 96% of New Zealand's images came with a story, but less than 30% of the international athletes came with a story. So they were being presented to us as bodies to be visually consumed. That had decreased a little bit by 2012. It was almost identical in 2016. So the vast majority of images had an accompanying story. And actually at Tokyo 2020, 100% of the international athletes' photos came with a story, and only 94% of the New Zealand ones, but that's mostly related to the pictures. You can see it on the slide, which was the media presented a lot of live interviews post-match, and those didn't come with a story. They just put them up there for people to listen to the interviews live. So in some ways that's quite a positive that we actually get to hear the athletes speaking for themselves. The other thing that's interesting is a decreasing focus on winning. And so at the beginning, almost over half the New Zealand coverage actually focused on athletes who had won a medal. It wasn't quite low for the international athletes, and that has remained quite low, partly because there isn't very much coverage of international athletes anyway. The overwhelming focus in New Zealand is us. But the fact that it's been dropping over time for New Zealand suggests that media are now starting to tell a much wider range of stories about Paralympic athletes. So it's not just, oh, look at this person, they won a medal. We start to hear about athletes of all kinds. We hear lots of different stories about them. We watch them go through the heats, and we get stories about each event. So there's definitely been a shift away from just that really narrow focus on winning. And I just want to finish with some challenges that I think are still there. One of them, and I think Dunya pointed to this aspect earlier too, is language. And I noticed this in both the Olympics and the Paralympics, but commentators, especially male commentators, seem really comfortable using the word man. So there's a few quotes under there, you know, the man who swims in lane 4, the man who is a gold medalist, the man who went fastest. But they seem to have an incredible problem with using the word woman. So they either replace it with nothing. So instead of the man who swims in lane 4, they might say Mary Smith from New Zealand who's swimming in lane 4. Or the go-to preference seems to be lady if they have to acknowledge a female athlete as an adult. And very rarely they use girl these days. So that's certainly a positive step. But I thought the best example I came across was a female and male commentator doing the marathon, where the female commentator says she knows this woman's trying to close the gap. And then the male commentator followed that by saying, and there's the lady who's in the gold medal position. So I think one thing Dunya and her students might want to work on is helping journalists become comfortable using the word woman. The other thing was there was quite significant differences in the representation of emotions. So there was very low percentage of male athletes smiling. They were always looking staunch or serious or in competition, but there was a much higher percentage of women smiling. I think up to 1/3 of the images of women showed them smiling. And not just commentary on tears for women, but almost an expectation that women would cry in deeply emotional moments. As you can see from the last quote, I'm sure there will be a few tears. Whereas when a male cried, that needed to be justified in some way by his success or, you know, what he'd actually achieved. And so the quote below that is by a male commentator justifying this by saying the tears are flowing, quite rightly so, a bronze medal and a lifetime best. And then even when we had commentators who were doing the same sport, we would see that they would describe male emotionality quite differently. So commentators, for example, described a female winner as really emotional, but a male winner who yelled and screamed and punched the air, he was described as pumped up or pretty excited. And then when his opponent, who had lost, was sitting there covering his face with a shirt, looking obviously not wanting anyone to see his facial expressions, rather than describe him as emotional, the commentator explained, this will be a tough defeat to take. So I think some of the languaging around gender is one of the things that we need to work on. And so that's it from me. We would really like to open it up for a discussion. So your own observations, your experiences, or your questions. And at the same time, we'd like to invite you all to join Women's Sport International. We're one of the few global organizations that's driven predominantly by research. So all the actions that we do are research informed and underpinned by understanding what's really going on. So you're welcome to visit our website or to email us at any time. I'm just going to stop sharing my screen so we can see each other. Welcome back. And yeah, we'd like to open it up to people. If you just want to put your hand up and let us know if you'd like to ask a question. Please remember to unmute.
Tony Skuro, I have a question.
Sure.
Can you hear me?
I
was wondering, you can hear me. I was just wondering, is it not positive that they actually mention the women athletes with a name? Because then only like this is a woman, because if you mention the name, it means that you have prepared yourself. So I think that if they would mention men with name and said there was a woman there, that would be worse. So for me, that is a kind of preparation that they really know it. Am I wrong?
Yeah, I didn't. It was interesting because it actually took a while for it for me to realize this was happening quite consistently, because the male commentators would also go, they'd introduce some of the men by their names, and then they would introduce usually they would use the man in lane 3 after that. But they just, it was more, yeah, I have to say the commentators that I heard on the live broadcast that I watched, they were really well prepared for both men and women. But it was just this really strange inability of commentators to use the word woman. And I've been debating it with women's sport journalist friends and colleagues, and we're all wondering if men in particular, but commentators, if there's something really threatening about the word woman. Is it because it's associated with women's rights or women's lib? I don't know, liberation. But I'd really encourage all of you to pay attention to see, if they called them men and women, that would be fine. It's more the inequality that stood out to me. So yes, Guru, it's great what they're doing and that they are well prepared.
And this is while maybe people are thinking of questions, these patterns are very consistent with patterns of what we call gender marking, right? Where in some cases women are marked with very particular gendered language, while men are not. And one of my colleagues, Dr. Steve Bianime, actually did an analysis of the Associated Press style book in terms of the guidelines in terms of language, and to analyze how journalistic guidelines are actually assisting journalists in covering sports. And so I think one of the solutions to some of these patterns is creating language-related guidelines for journalists, or enhancing them or modifying them, right? And certainly it helps when these guidelines are available around the Paralympics as well, right? But specifically regarding women's sports.
And I think Dunya and I both have a positive attitude towards journalists in terms of trying to work with them. Like, because I was an ex-journalist, you've been a journalist too, haven't you, Dunya?
No,
some
no, I was educated in journalism.
Yeah. So there's, I know a lot of journalists, and I know most of them want to do the best job they can. But so in some ways, when we do this work, it's not really about demonizing the media. It's more about trying to understand what's going on and then trying to share the results in a way that are like, we know you're trying to do a good job. So here are some things that we think you might want to consider. Yeah, so the woman one, is this the first time I've ever noticed it? And I'm still puzzling over what it might actually mean, to be honest. So I don't know this. I know there's two of you from wheelchair basketball, or basketball, not rugby. Sorry, yes, I'm from New Zealand. We only do wheelchair rugby mostly. Do you notice any of those kinds of things in the coverage? Is that the gender differences or different use of language in what you actually consume in the media?
I haven't really noticed the language part, but my assumption would be the differences between masculinity and the femininity. Using the term lady over woman, or even female. You may hear female more so than you hear woman. And that would bring my thought and perspective to when you're reporting from a male perspective, that you don't want to give that leverage or the level playing field for a woman versus a man because of the masculinity behind sport between genders. That would be my perspective on that language component.
Yeah. Yeah, I really think women seems to be a terrifying word. So we should own it. That's why we're Women's Sport International, not Female Sport International. Anyone else? Makiko, do you have any thoughts?
To be honest, I don't really have anything to add. I am interested in women's sports, but this is not my specialty. Like, it's just something that I'm really interested in these days. So, and for Paralympics this year, I mostly watched on Japanese TV, not in the Canadian media. So I couldn't really, and also I was more focused on performance rather than listening to commentators, so I can't really talk about it. But it was interesting. Like in Japan, they did a really, really good job covering all the Paralympic sports, and I think commentators did a good study preparing for their coverage. And yeah, but it would be interesting. I think in the future, they're going to cover more Paralympic sports and hopefully women with disabilities too. But I will try to listen to what they are actually saying and then what terminology they use.
Yeah, I really noticed there was a big emphasis on performance language as well. I mean, so the women one was really the only one that stood out to me, and a little bit about emotions, that they were very, very focused on, talking about their training, their lead up, the amount of medals they'd won before, what their expectations were for the games, how their specific disability might provide advantage or disadvantage, because I watched a lot of swimming. So they were, but what I thought was, and Dunya, I'd be interested in your perspective, and Becky's, yours too, is I see now, it used to be, they didn't show the disability at all. So tried to present the athlete as much more like an able-bodied normal athlete, or it was some kind of exotic body to be looked at. But I see them starting to really integrate the disability and the athlete together. And so the disability was being integrated into the commentary in a way that it was, how has this disability affected how the person trains or how they will actually approach the race? And so I I can really see that media have been trying to get a level of understanding that will allow them to integrate. And I saw that in the Olympics around pregnancy. There were, other than maybe one British super mum, the New Zealand media was very much just talking about pregnancy in terms of the way that it affected training or time out from training, how they were managing it, because we had quite a few of our top level sportswomen who had taken time out to have children. But it was never that they were a mum, it was that they were an athlete or a world champion, and as part of their training they accommodated having a child. And so I could see that sort of integration happening across both events. But again, I try to be optimistic, so I might be totally wrong. Dunya, any thoughts?
I think we're seeing maybe what happens during coverage of particular events is, if there is continuity of coverage, then the commentators become more and more knowledgeable, right? And they can actually also speak to previous games, right? I mean, if an athlete performed, at the previous Olympics or Paralympics, and we're seeing these patterns. I'm noticing this in coverage of women's sports at the Olympics or even at the World Cup, right? The FIFA Women's World Cup, that even in context, a lot of my research focuses on Central and Eastern Europe. And so, the commentators might have sort of that knowledge and continuity. And so I'm wondering if we will start seeing sort of better informed coverage as there is more visibility on the Paralympics. I know with my students a few years ago, we watched wheelchair basketball and coverage, and we were trying to break down the broadcasts, and it seemed like at least the excerpts that we were listening to was knowledgeable about the athletes and focusing on the play, right? And so I think in general we've been seeing, in terms of broadcast coverage of women's sports, a little bit less of a gendered language. And one of the things that Makiko mentioned is, there are multiple elements of a broadcast that people are paying attention to. And actually some of the research in media psychology is really trying to separate those elements and thinking about, okay, well, if there is, what we call problematic language or commentary, how does that affect the viewing experience, or does it affect the viewing experience? Because maybe people are focused on the visual, or particularly in terms of promoting the Paralympics or events that include athletes with disabilities. One of the factors that scholars examined was, well, how does the type of music shape perceptions, right? And whether it's sort of this emotional music as a part of it, right? Or is there a focus on the athletic competence? And so these are all factors that I think, when we think about on a practical level from journalist perspective, how can these be improved? There really, this is where I'm trying to be optimistic as well, right? That obviously there are larger issues that need to be addressed, right? But there are also small aspects in production of media that can make a really large difference.
So anybody else got any questions or comments? I mean, particularly, I guess, not to pick on Makiko and Andrea, but because you've got that kind of experience and you have an investment in maybe wanting to make sure that you get the kind of coverage you want. Did anything we talk about surprise you, or is it in line with the kinds of things that you experience? And you can just go, I have no idea, that's fine. Like, does women's, are you involved with men's wheelchair or women's wheelchair?
Women's.
So
well, both, actually.
Yeah. Does it get the same amount of coverage as the men's, just on a sort of regular basis? So is it
the men the men get a little bit more in the US, and excuse me, but the focus with the women is more so on the group versus the individuals. For the men, it may be more of the individual athletes, and how their experiences mean more to the team versus with the women, it's more of the team orientation versus the individuals. But we are, in the US, we're limited in the number of women who have great experience. And so with the men, on the men's side, they have a lot more eligible men to participate in wheelchair basketball. And so that may be a factor in the reason why they get more coverage, because they have more top level male athletes than we do women athletes. But typically for the women athletes, it's more of the team orientation versus the individual athletes themselves. Or if there's a story behind the women athletes, whereas one may be an international athlete, professional athlete, you may have a mother, you may have the educator, there's always that behind the story that pulls into the women's side of sport for wheelchair basketball.
Yeah. Okay. Anybody else got any questions or comments? We'd just be really interested in you know, whether what we're saying aligns with your experiences, I guess.
I think that it's Guro again. I'm
Yep.
sitting here thinking, because I don't live in Norway any longer, but one of the most that are in media in Norway is actually Paralympic athletes. And she is really the focus overall. So I would guess that she is more and less on overall athletes in media. So it's, and I think they are quite equal actually of who they are showing when it comes to female and men and women. And also, I think that when you are sitting in another country trying to look Olympic Games, you really see how national the country are focusing. Because I almost not see any Norwegian athletes, except from when they are competing against Switzerland or Germany. So I think that that's also a little bit overall, actually. Yeah. And just, yeah. I have also one more comment. In Norwegian, and I guess there would be the same in Swedish and Danish. Kvinne or man is so difficult to say, or it doesn't make a flute. So you would, in Norway or Sweden, you would probably say the name, or you would say an athlete. And I'm quite sure it would be equal. I don't have any proof, but from thinking, I think it is like that.
Yeah, and in some countries there isn't really a word for that. So, you know, they probably wouldn't have those specific language differences. Yeah, I think Norway, Denmark, and Sweden probably similar to New Zealand. You know, we know that small country. Well, I'm going to say we know. I'm not sure I can ground that fully in research, but smaller countries tend to focus a lot on their own athletes, and they tend to have fewer athletes that win a lot of medals, and so we would expect to see different patterns in the US that might be much more gendered, because the journalists do have to make these choices between which athletes are actually going to get coverage. Whereas in New Zealand, it doesn't really matter who you are. If you win a medal, we think you're marvelous. But we do notice that there is almost always, and it happens in the Olympics too, a couple of athletes who sort of rise to the top as become the media darlings. So we have a Paralympic swimmer, Sophie Pascoe, who became New Zealand's most medaled Paralympian at these games. She's competed at three Paralympics, and she's articulate and, you know, usually wins 3 or 4 medals per game. So, you know, I think in 2016, 33% of our coverage was just of her. So there's that sort of distillation down sometimes that you're sort of talking about, you know, that there's often one athlete that becomes the darling, but it's usually based on success.
But I think that it comes from Germany also, because I see German television, and I don't see almost any other athletes than the German. So they're also focusing on.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Across the world, we definitely are much more interested in us than them.
This is consistent with the data that I've found in in Central and Eastern European context. And one of the things that happens is, especially for, I mean, I think also like the structure of sport, right? If we sort of try to break it down, I mean, in some team sports, you have the group phase, and then you have the, you know, people are advancing and all that. And so there might be more continuity in coverage. But for individual, a lot of the individual sports where it's you compete, and then if you don't win, that's it for you, right? And so the broadcast schedule might, you know, there might be a broadcast of that small event, you know, and then while you didn't qualify, we're no longer going to cover that event. Or so there is, you know, and I think this speaks to sort of the question of both, okay, well, do we get to really learn about athletes from different countries when we consume in, you know, Paralympic media or even Olympic media? But it also speaks to this question of what Dr. Cheryl Cookie and colleagues found in their study on the US context, but I think it applies to other ones, is this idea of when women's sports are covered, it's one and done, right? There is a little bit less of a continuity in some of the, in coverage of the sports, whereas with some men's sports in particular, we're seeing sort of more sort of more continuous coverage. I don't know to what extent this applies to Paralympic athletes, because really a lot of the data that we have is based on the time period of the Paralympic Games. And the data that I have so far read about the routine media coverage indicates that perhaps there is a small attention on individual star athletes, but not sort of continuity of broadcasts. But again, I think there is a lot of variance in different countries in terms of which sports get emphasized based on success, right?
Yeah. Cool. Well, we're actually at our 1.5 hour timeline, so we can open it up for any more questions. If you want, I know we've got a couple of Japanese, but actually you all speak English, so we probably don't need to make any differences then. Often if you would like to ask your question in another language and there's someone else who can understand that, we're happy for you to do that. But I think actually we're probably okay today. So if there aren't any more questions, I just thank you all for coming. It's really nice to have a chance to talk about what we're doing, and also hear from people who are interested and or directly involved in some of the things we're talking about. So yeah, we're really happy to stay in touch if any of you have other questions that you'd like to ask us. And again, you can find us easily on the web, and if you want to join us, we'd be very happy to have your company and your expertise and contributions. So Diane, would you like to say anything just to finish up as president?
Thanks, Tony. I just want to say thank you to everybody. I hope that you learned something, that you benefit from the discussion. I found it very interesting. I'm always finding these kinds of topics interesting. So I hope that this kind of effort and webinars that we're trying to do on a regular basis, that we'll get more and more people engaged in them. So thank you to the three of you on the panel. I think Becky, Dunja, and Tony, it was good information. And I look forward to reading your articles that are coming out shortly. Make sure that we get them, so maybe we can post them on our website so the rest of you can see them, and we can share them if that's possible. And thank you for participating today. So that's my message, and till the next time.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Have a good night, day, morning, next 24 hours. So I'm just going to stop recording.